Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to make a start and we might have a few more people joining us in the next few minutes. But everyone who's in the room, welcome to the third session of the Train the Trainer Active Learning Workshop. This session today is about addressing legal and ethical issues relating to EOSC. I'm going to be running the session. My name is Louise Bezuidenhout. I'm a data expert at DUNS, which is a data archiving and network services in the Netherlands. And I'm joined by a lot of other colleagues from Work Package 9 who are going to assist with the training today. We've got a number of people. We've got Lisa Hirsch from AUSDA. We've got Irina from IFIL, Milica from IFIL, Irena from the University of Ljubljana, and my colleagues Kim and Pascal from DUNS. So we've got a really nice group of people, and we hope we'll be able to guide you through some of the issues relating to ethical and legal and EOSC, and hopefully answer some questions that you might have. Just a few housekeeping issues. We are recording the session for people who aren't able to join today. If you're not comfortable being recorded, please do let us know in the chat, and we can try and work out a way that you can still participate in the session without being recorded. But without further ado, I will share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Yes? Right. So the learning outcomes for today are three. We'd like you to be able to understand the ethical and legal issues relating to EOSC services, products, and usage. We'd like to enable you to be confident in addressing ethical and legal queries on EOSC, or at least confident enough to start this process, because we recognize 2 hours is not really long enough to turn everyone into ethical and legal experts. And we'd like to enable you to confidently host ethical and legal discussions on EOSC within your own institutions. Oopsie. So the plan for the day is we're going to have a few welcome activities. We're going to do a Mentimeter, of course, because everyone likes a Mentimeter. I'm then going to give a short overview of some of the ethical and legal issues relating to EOSC. And then we're going to drill down into two categories that I think usually are very high on the list of issues that people want to discuss. And that's issues to do with safe and responsible use of data and how it relates to EOSC, and issues to do with equitable access, so equal access to EOSC resources and products. Because this session is specifically designed for trainers, we're going to spend the latter half of the workshop looking at teaching tools that you can use to stimulate interactive discussions on ethical and legal issues. And I hope that will be a really good resource for you to take forward as you start planning how to teach on these issues in your own institution. We do have quite a lot of time for discussion at the end, so please feel free at any point to either post your questions in the chat, unmute yourself, or to use the other chat tools that I will introduce throughout the session. So I'm now going to switch to the Menti, which someone can post the link in the chat. The code is 39263712. So please go to Menti and let us know where you're joining from. Ooh, the first from the Netherlands. Well, welcome. I presume you are down the road from us because everything in the Netherlands is quite down the road. I've got someone from Madrid. That's great. Another Dutch. Ireland as well. Lovely to see you here. And so even with this sample size, you can see we've got people joining from all over the EU, and that's really great because this really reflects the heart of what is EOSC, that it's a pan-European initiative, and it's intended to not only share resources and infrastructure, but also to share expertise. So it's lovely to see everyone here, and we hope that we'll be building up a community of EOSC trainers that can take forward training on EOSC and share best practices in the future. So I think we'll move on to the next slide. which is what discipline do you normally provide training in? Most people on the call, at least, will be training in some form within their institutions. So do you provide general training, social sciences, health sciences? What discipline are you working in? We've got a really nice mix of disciplines here, and obviously, again, reflecting what EOSC is going to be to the research communities around Europe. But it's also particularly interesting for this session on ethical and legal issues, because there will definitely be specific issues that are more disciplinary pertinent, and that we need to discuss. So we'll be looking at that at these issues, not only from a more general EOSC perspective, but if you have specific issues relating to your discipline, please feel free to raise them as well. And then the final one, to just give an idea of what level of confidence we have in the room, how confident do you feel providing training on open science, FAIR, RCR, and GDPR? And I think if I've set up the slide correctly, you'd have to rank them. See GDPR and RCR fighting it out at the bottom, but it's great to see that everyone feels quite confident training on open and FAIR, because that really is at the heart of EOSC. I think we've stabilized. Okay, GDPR definitely was the one that we were anticipating would raise a lot of questions within this workshop. So it is something that we are conscious, not only that we need to talk about a lot in this workshop, but that there will be further training on in the future. So now we will go back to the slides, and I'm going to give a short overview of some issues to do with ethical and legal and EOSC as a way of starting the conversation. And just to my colleagues, please do monitor the chat if there are any queries. At any point, if there is something that you'd like me to stop and reiterate for clarification, or if you're finding my accent difficult or I'm speaking too fast, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I'm very happy to break and go over a section again. So I guess the first question to really ask is, why are we talking about ethical and legal issues, not only related to EOSC, but more generally in relation to research? The thinking around ethics and legal has really coalesced around 4 key objectives for research in the modern age. And that is a recognition that research needs to increase public trust in science, well, actually in all research, and not to waste public resources, because most research done within the EU is funded by taxpayer money. It's funded by huge investment in research. And therefore, researchers have an obligation to the public to ensure that the money is well spent. There's an increased interest in getting societal actors involved in research. So getting constructive feedback, getting participation in research is also very key to modern research. We see that in the evolution of the citizen science movement and other business governance science interactions. There's a recognized need to be international and inclusive, recognizing that many of the research problems that need to be solved cannot be done in silos, cannot be done by individual countries, and that we need a global movement towards research in order to address particularly the Sustainable Development Goals that have been identified as key to the future survival of humanity. And then finally, there's a recognition that we need to increase the speed of discovery. Research in the past has not been efficiently run, and we need new ways of organizing research, organizing the dissemination of research findings, and organizing collaboration in order to speed up discovery and really meet the targets that we're setting for ourselves as researchers. So these objectives, of course, have raised a number of ethical and legal issues. And when we think about them, they are quite diverse. When we think about data and particularly ethical issues, we're thinking about a number of different things. We're thinking about the reproducibility crisis. We're thinking about issues of informed consent and the protection of vulnerable individuals, particularly around human sciences. We're thinking about respect for national data protection requirements, and particularly around Indigenous knowledge and data ownership. We're thinking about the misuse of data and scooping of data. This comes up quite a lot when we talk to researchers about their concerns about open science. We'd like to see better benefits and benefits sharing, and we'd like to see better access, public access to data. So when we think about these legal issues relating to data, of course, there are a number that we recognize. We already talked about the GDPR and the control of sensitive data becoming incredibly topical as we're seeing increased sharing of data and increased ways of moving data around the research ecosystem. We're seeing issues to do with the need for alignment of policies on data and research, the alignment of copyright expectations, issues to do with ownership and the control of research products, the concerns around misuse of data and scooping of data, and the concerns about how to mediate public access without causing any sort of harms. So these concerns have really driven forward a lot of discussion around data and ethical legal issues. And it has coalesced into the prominence of a number of different movements. The first, of course, is open science. So open science has been a huge driver in emphasizing the communal nature of research and the importance of sharing to enhance reproducibility, societal benefits, trust, and transparency. So it's really changing the way we view responsibility. Open science is, of course, linked to responsible conduct of research. This is a framework that provides, in a way, a blueprint of what good research practices should look like and how to minimize misconduct. I think for misconduct, most of you will be familiar with what we call the FFP misconducts, which is fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, as the big, if you would say, no-nos of research. Fair data standards are incredibly important in shaping the reusability of data, foregrounding the importance of responsible data collection and curation, and linked to fair data are the care data standards outlining the use of Indigenous data. Then we're also seeing a number of other issues coming up. So GDPR came out in the last decade, outlining the general data protection regulation and similar policies safeguarding against misuse of sensitive personal information. We're seeing a huge rise in the number of research policies on data sharing, research conduct, open access, and so forth. We're seeing the field of bioethics supporting discussions on responsible use and reuse of data, on how to maximize beneficence, which is the obligation to do good, and non-maleficence, which is the converse obligation not to cause harm. And then we're seeing increasing public engagement in research directed towards maximizing societal benefits and addressing the larger challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals that I already mentioned. So I'm sure for many of you, or most of you on the call, the areas that I've just mentioned are not unknown to you, and you will already have seen many of these ethical and legal approaches in action within research. So most of you will have some sort of GDPR compliance at an institutional and national level. You will see the inclusion of GDPR officers, so trained individuals able to deal with GDPR issues embedded within your institution. You would have seen open science expectations being developed on institutional and national levels, as well as coming into funding requirements, particularly around open data and open access, and also in the community expectations, so how the general public is expecting to engage with research. You will have seen a rise in the amount of responsible conduct of research training within your institutions, and the expectations made of the researchers on institutional and also on national levels. You will have seen funding objectives aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many large-scale funding schemes that specifically address certain SDGs. And then finally, you would have seen fair data changing the way we're thinking about data management and the way we're talking about storage practices and curation. And it's important to recognize that these things are influencing the way research is being conducted on institutional and national levels, but they're also being embedded into research infrastructures, such as the European Research Infrastructure Consortia, or ERICS, as most of us will know them, such as LifeWatch, BBMRI, CESDA, Clarin, and others like Elixir. So in all these different areas, I'm sure that you and the researchers that you work with will have had some sort of engagement and perhaps some sort of training already. So what does this mean for EOSC? So obviously these are large issues that are changing the way research is being done and changing the way we're thinking about responsibility and compliance. So what does this really mean for EOSC as it goes forward? And what I'd like to highlight in this talk is that understanding how these issues are playing out in EOSC really starts with an understanding of the key structural aspects of EOSC. So in the session on Monday, which I hope many of you would have had the opportunity to attend, Ellie Dake from Dance was talking about the structure of EOSC, and she mentioned that it is a federated infrastructure. It links existing infrastructures, so it's not an entirely new infrastructure, but more a coordination between the existing infrastructures. It is inter-European by intention, and it is provider and community managed. So there's a lot of engagement with researchers to design EOSC in a way that makes sense for them and what they'd like to see research looking like in the future. And key to EOSC as well is the fact that it's fostering open and fair research. So it is open and fair by design. So the structure of EOSC is also important in understanding how it anticipates identifying and engaging with some of the problems identified in current research. So this is an objectives tree in this TRIA, which I think is incredibly useful, and I would encourage you to go and have a closer look at it. But what this objectives tree is really identifying is a recognition that there are certain problems in research that need to be addressed, and that EOSC can be very instrumental in addressing these problems in certain ways. So for instance, the problem that public and private sectors do not exploit open science for improving quality and productivity of research reflects the barriers that there's an absence of incentives, rewards, and skills for open sharing that stifles the uptake of open science. EOSC has the objective to make open science practices and skills rewarded and taught and become the new normal within European research, which will lead to benefits such as improved trust, quality, and productivity of science. Similarly, research is not combined and building on ever-growing available scientific results means that scientific results are unfindable, inaccessible, not interoperable, and often only used once. EOSC, by being fair by design, will anticipate and aim to have standards and tools and services allowing researchers to find, access, reuse, and combined results, which will lead to the development of innovative services and products. And finally, the national, European, and global infrastructures not sharing open science standards and practices is an infrastructural problem that means that the scientific landscape consists of national and disciplinary silos and infrastructures. By being a federation, EOSC can create a sustainable and federated infrastructure that enables open sharing of scientific results, which will improve the impact of research in addressing societal challenges. So these the structure of EOSC and the recognition of these problems has led to EOSC being developing a number of guiding principles that help position EOSC within the Horizon Europe and shape its development. And these principles are really important when you start thinking about how EOSC is going to look in the future and how it already looks. EOSC is and will be in the future research community centered. So it places research at the center of the initiative and prioritizes engagement with research communities. It's multi-stakeholder, so it prioritizes a multi-stakeholder approach. It's open and fair by design. It is by intention a federation of infrastructures. So EOSC builds on existing and upcoming research infrastructures rather than creating an entirely new infrastructure that needs to be integrated into the research landscape. And EOSC prioritizes machine actionability. So trying to strike the right balance between machines and people in delivering services that will serve the needs of European scientists. So when thinking about ethics and EOSC, I would like you to really recognize that the answer is really in the structure. So EOSC recognizes that there are challenges such as safeguarding and facilitating data usage and movement across borders, ensuring equitable access and use of data and services, ensuring responsible use of data and services, and facilitating societal engagement. However, these challenges are hoped to be addressed by key infrastructural developments within EOSC. And the first is AAI, so the authentication and authorization infrastructure. A massive amount of work that EOSC is doing aligning policies on data sharing and open access and FAIR. The ability of EOSC to monitor usage and to have oversight of usage, the fact that it is fair by design and will facilitate and foster fair data practices in research going forward. And the fact that EOSC is prioritizing education not only on a general level, but also for different user and provider communities, with the anticipation that EOSC will become a hub not only for the research community, but for all communities interested in using research data, such as governments, such as industry, and the general public. So I think this will be the take-home message for this section, how to guide users in responsible EOSC usage. I think the first thing to do is to get researchers to understand the ethical and legal issues within research. As I said in the previous slides, most of the ethical and legal issues associated with EOSC usage are already being addressed in the broader research environment. And understanding these issues such as fair, open, responsible conduct of research and so forth, and how they're addressed are key to starting discussions about EOSC usage. So obviously a good understanding of issues such as FAIR is really key in going forward to actually tackle what is EOSC and how do I use it. The next step is, of course, understanding the structure of EOSC. Understanding that EOSC is a federated infrastructure is key to understanding the ethical and legal questions. Because it's a federated infrastructure, it is linking the bottom-up best practices of infrastructures across Europe. And most users will access EOSC through these existing research infrastructures that already have very clear sets of rules and training. These infrastructures will also be key in providing a link between EOSC and the researchers in the specific communities by providing updates to these rules and communicating what's happening both through EOSC and the infrastructures. And the third thing is really to continue to discuss workflows. All of us will recognize that we are at the beginning of EOSC rather than at the final product, and EOSC is rapidly evolving, and it's likely that many processes will change over time. So continually discussing the workflows, discussing challenges and concerns will really enable researchers and you as trainers to keep up to date on best practices. It's very important to do things like sign up to mailing lists and to be updated on what's happening in EOSC and so forth. So educating about ethical and legal aspects of EOSC can seem quite intimidating, and particularly if you don't have a background in these areas or you don't have a background in EOSC, as I know most of you won't. However, I hope this presentation has really shown that most of the ethical and legal issues relating to EOSC map very clearly onto existing discussions in open science, in GDPR, in FAIR, in RCR, and in policy alignment. So it's not a case of having to understand entirely new issues, but rather just understanding how these issues extend to include EOSC. Key to teaching about ethical and legal issues is to really trust your own understanding, to initiate discussions and really let your students guide you in setting the agenda, to be enable them to highlight what is really worrying them. And there are many teaching tools and suggestions for you to use to stimulate the discussions that we're going to talk about in the second half of this workshop. So at this point, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions at this point. Does anyone have any clarification questions that you'd like, or anything that you'd like to raise? Absolute silence.
Louise, just to add, there's a discussion in the chat, but I'll also, I see Pauline has a hand raised.
I'm afraid I can't see the chat at the moment. So please, whoever had their hand raised, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question that is, it kind of relates to what you mentioned about, the challenges in EOSC about, sharing of data across borders and things like that. And there are things where on our side, we are really struggling to help our partners, which is data sharing across borders. We are federated research infrastructure, and we know that there are quite specific rules per country about scientific data sharing, for example. So, for example, the French institution clearly told us that the use of like cloud, especially American cloud, was really not something to go for. But when we have raised this question in EOSC events, EOSC symposiums, and it seems that it's basically something that people do not really have a solution about and kind of pretend is not existing. And I don't know if you have a good solution, like a good place where to look for this regulation and how to homogenize, like, the thing is that in a research infrastructure, the data sharing is part of what we do, because we offer services in different countries and our scientists are moving. And for data sharing, we are also looking for cloud solution, because it's where the EOSC is going, and facilitates reuse of data and easy transfer of data. But clearly we are also facing like policy blocks from countries, and we are really lacking information, clear information from the countries and from the EOSC and the EU in general about how to handle these issues. So I don't know if you have a...
So if I understand correctly, you're talking about the problems of moving data across borders, and particularly using cloud storage facilities that are outside the EU. I'm anticipating you're talking about things like Dropbox and how it is not GDPR compliant.
And even, I mean, depending on the country, even within Europe, transferring data from one country to the other is not something that is really approved. But a lot of the cloud solutions are international and rely on very often American cloud system like AWS, and many people use it without really questioning it. But the reality is that at the national level, it is very often not accepted.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is not a question that there's an easy answer to. Definitely issues to do with cloud storage are very complex, and particularly as you said, you know, when the cloud storages are actually located outside of the EU in the US, they can be subject to US legislation like the Patriot Act, which can lead to concerns about GDPR violations. So it is a very complex issue. Unfortunately, because it is a complex issue, there's not a clear solution at the moment, but it is definitely something that is being prioritized within EOSC as a need to identify solutions for. So there's a lot of work going on about policy alignment and understanding what safe and responsible usage of data should look like. But I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer. Rather than just to say, yes, I recognize it is a concern and it's definitely something that is being worked on. Would any of the other trainers like to chip in?
Hi, I just added also in the chat, which you'll see later. So there was a special task that was dedicated to the secure data facilities in a SHOC project. And there are some deliverables on that, and I would recommend people to review that. So basically, instead of just trying to pick something that is commercial, there are different elements being looked into. And I recognize, and I know because we were doing some work back in CESDA's environment also, that different countries have different regulations, and French is one of the most restricted. In this case, especially when we're talking about really sensitive data, and this is something that will need to be viewed further. And Irina?
Maybe when Katz will say the same, but we are working with our colleague Prodromos to produce some guidance for providers on GDPR issues and terms of use. And hopefully we'll have a webinar about that in December. So we'll share more information, and I think some of your questions will be addressed there. Over to you, Kat.
Did I see another hand? Oh,
yeah, and Irina, you did kind of beat me to it, but that's okay. I also want to say, regarding the issue of sensitive data as well, that's something that we are actually actively looking into as a training topic in Work Package 9 of EOSC Future. And indeed, we will be delivering some training on that in 2023. There's even going to be a physical workshop as well. And to the best of my knowledge, there is a technological solution being built for sensitive data as well. So this isn't completely to do with GDPR and all that, but it's a big part of this equation. And at least for EOSC users, there will be some kind of technical capability to do so.
Thanks. Yeah, the issue on our side has not that much been on the GDPR aspect, but really the transfer of scientific data. But I mean, part of it is related. Thanks for the links and the answer.
So I think this conversation is great, and it's actually anticipating the next few slides that I was going to talk about. Maybe we should get through these slides and then get to the exercise, because I don't want to lose the richness of these responses. What I'd anticipated is that we work on developing a question and answer sheet that can be used by the participants when they go home and start planning their own research teaching. So unless there are any more clarification questions, maybe we press on and then we can spend a bit more time doing the question and answers. Yes. Okay, so the as I said, there are two topics that I wanted to really spend a bit more time on, and the first was safe and responsible use, and our colleagues have already anticipated that, and the second one is equitable access. So just to talk about safe and responsible use a bit more, there are obviously a huge amount of issues to do with safety and responsible use in responsible research. We see this coming up over and over again in conversations, concerns about the misuse of data and or the unintended consequences of reuse, issues to do with control of sensitive personal data, issues to do with ownership, credit, and citation of data, and issues to do with data loss. And we're seeing these concerns being addressed in a number of different areas. We've already talked about GDPR legislation and implementation. We know that many institutions already have data management policies. The assigning of PIDs, so persistent identifiers, to data and research outputs is really helping the way we can track and monitor data usage. We're seeing credit and other accreditation systems, making sure that people are getting credit for dissemination of data and reuse of data. Core Trust Seal and other repository certifications are ensuring that data are placed in trusted digital repositories and are properly curated and managed. And then, of course, education. We're seeing a huge rise in the amount of education rolling out around control of data, safe and responsible use of data. However, just based on my experience around talking about EOSC and sensitive data, there are a number of common concerns that do pop up with regularity. And the first is a misconception that EOSC will facilitate some sort of free-for-all in terms of data access. To counter that misperception, it's important to recognize that EOSC is a federation of research infrastructures, and that data management is controlled on the infrastructure level and is only aligned and overseen by EOSC. So there is not a huge amount of data being moved into this hypothetical EOSC, but rather the repositories and the infrastructures are still maintaining their excellence in data management, and then just access is being aligned and overseen by EOSC. And EOSC is working actively to align data management and access policies to ensure this seamless and responsible access to data across Europe. The second misconception is that EOSC will enable more users with questionable objectives to have access to data. And to counter that, it's important to recognize that the EOSC AAI, which is the authentication and authorization infrastructure, will ensure that all users are verified. So it will enable a level of security within EOSC to make sure that everyone who is using EOSC and using the services and the data has some sort of authentication behind them. The third concern is that EOSC will cause users to lose out on credit for research contributions by creating this mass of data. But because EOSC is fair by design, it will ensure that all data are assigned appropriate PIDs and well, not only data, but all research contributions. And that will assist in applying things like the crediting and accreditation infrastructure matrices. Another concern about EOSC is that data can get lost. Of course, it's important to recognize that EOSC supports Core Trust Seal certification of trusted digital repositories, and having more CTS certified repositories within the ecosystem will really improve the level of curation and the level of oversight of our data assets. There is also going to be long-term investment in infrastructure to ensure the stability of TDRs going forward. So it's a really exciting time to be working in the repository landscape and seeing the improvements that are being made. Another concern is that users from other countries and disciplines will not understand the way researchers are working or assigning credit, and this can cause European researchers to lose out on credit. However, there is concerted effort to provide education and learning pathways for different user communities, particularly for the general public and so forth, to ensure that the traditions and practices within research are being respected. And the interdisciplinary usage of EOSC is being monitored. And at the moment, there are case studies being developed to provide guidance on how to manage interdisciplinary use and how to align expectations between disciplines. Now, final concern is that sensitive data won't or can't be properly managed by EOSC, but all sensitive data are held by trusted digital repositories and not actually by EOSC. And EOSC, as we've already discussed, is working to align GDPR principles and practices and other related policies to ensure that there's a seamless, safe infrastructure and policy environment that guides the use of sensitive data. So now we're going to go back to the Menti, and I would like you to be able to add some comments in the Menti. So particularly looking at any concerns you have about safe and responsible use of EOSC services and products, and what you'd like to know in order to provide better training on these issues. So please feel free to add as many as you want, and then we are going to collate those questions and put them into a Google Doc and have a discussion about them, and hopefully come up with some answers or some suggestions that you can take forward and use in your trainings. Of course, if there are no questions, that's also great. Okay, so we've got one question. What does as open as possible, as close as necessary, as required mean in practice? Tools and ways for safety anonymization of health data. Okay. Rules being too complicated to be understood and followed by the user. What if a research has access via institution, but then in between contracts and loses access temporarily? Getting some great questions here. How will AI actually work for access to closed environments, since it's possible to log in with social accounts as well? So maybe give it another minute or two so you can add some more questions, and then we will all go to a Google Doc and start a discussion about these questions and what ideas we have about answering them. Okay, we've got another question. Ooh, they're coming in thick and fast now. How will PI be managed amongst the deposited data? Huh? Okay. So now I'll put this in the chat. We are going to, my fabulous colleagues have been inputting those into the Google Doc, and now we can all start going to the Google Doc and trying to start a discussion about these. It's important to recognize that obviously we as trainers do not have answers to all these questions, but what we're hoping is that we can have a discussion about them, have some clarity. If we have answers, we can provide them. And if not, we will be able to go out and reach out to our other colleagues in EOSC and find the answers. And then after this session, we will be able to send round a more enriched version of this table that you can use as a resource in your training. Okay. So I think it's really nice not only to have people typing answers, but also to have a discussion about it. So let's take the first question. What does as open as possible, as close as required mean in practice? Irina, you've got your hand up.
I started typing because I think a generic answer would be that all specific details should be addressed in the DMP, and it would really depend on the discipline, on the type of data, on collaboration agreements, and other issues. But I don't know. Would be happy to hear what others think about that.
Absolutely. I think, you know, with EOSC and with all open science practices, the ambition is to make data as open as is feasibly possible, but there is a recognition that some data should not be made entirely open because of issues to do with sensitive data and so forth. So recognizing those limitations, but still trying to be as open as possible is very important. It's also important to recognize that open data and fair data are not the same. And even if data cannot be made open, it should still be made as fair as possible. Venkat, I saw you had your hand up.
I think you just said exactly what I was going to say.
We are of one mind when it comes to this.
And I think also important to stress that when it comes to sensitive data, that one can at least make the metadata available.
That is absolutely true. The metadata is incredibly important. So please, if anyone from the audience would like to add anything, because there is expertise within the audience as well, please feel free to unmute yourself. We'll just have a discussion. The second question was on tools and ways for safe anonymization of health data. Someone has put in the link for Amnesia, which is an open air tool. There's also a great open source tool called Data Shield that's run by the University of Newcastle. Someone is typing about legal experts, which would be great to hear.
Yeah, maybe I'll say what I was typing. What I often hear from legal experts that real anonymization isn't really possible, and we should be really frank what we're doing, and it's really pseudo anonymization and not real anonymization. But again, it depends on type of data.
I think it's a very good point to raise, Irina, that when we talk about anonymization, we have to recognize that particularly for smaller data sets, it's very difficult to guarantee full anonymization. And it is very important within the informed consent forms to recognize any sort of limitations in anonymization before you make commitments to your research population that cannot be met. I'd just like to say, if anyone who asked the question doesn't feel it's being answered, please unmute yourself and press us for more information. But
there is another issue with anonymization. Sometimes it's possible to do the full anonymization, but the reusability of the data that are fully anonymized is disputable. So that's why we should be honest and say we are doing pseudo-anonymization because we don't want to actually decrease the quality of the data, but we explain how we actually preserve the data that are not anonymized and should be protected, and who has access to what. So that's there are many issues. It's not, sometimes it's possible to do full anonymization, but the data won't be usable at all.
And Pauline, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, it's a bit related to my comment, which is the one about rules being too complicated to be used. And also a few comments that I've seen both in the chat and here, which talk about data protection experts, legal experts. One of my big concerns about EOSC is that it's supposed to be extremely open. What I see is that in many institutions, we have more and more legal experts, ethical experts, data experts, training experts, but a lot of institutions that are small, do not have capacity to get all this expertise. So we really need to have rules that can be followed by all, or offer support for smaller institutions that do not have the capacity to follow up very complicated administrative burden. And I feel like that's where, with the EOSC trying to be open, we very often end up closing down many people and not being as open as we would like. Sorry, it's not very constructive, just a comment.
I think it's a very important point. And I think, I mean, like the object of sessions like this is to raise these concerns, because these will obviously factor into how people approach EOSC and what value they see in EOSC. I do hope that with the smaller institutions, EOSC will be able to provide them with some sort of training and support that would perhaps upskill them, but I do recognize it as a problem. I mean, it's also a problem with different institutions having different levels of access to resources, and sometimes, you know, having the resources to be able to implement a huge legal department or training for GDPR officers is challenging. But hopefully EOSC will be able to provide some sort of support. Does anyone else from the training team or anyone else? Oh, Armin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I often have the feeling that when it comes to these restrictions and rules, that immediately everybody gets into that frenzy. Oh, it's all too complicated and we can't, and it's and so on. So what I'm trying to do is usually to say, let's focus on the low-hanging fruits first. Meaning to say, okay, there is data that we can make openly available and that has none of these issues, so let's do that. And if I develop support services for my for my researchers, then I'm saying, okay, I'm supporting this first and foremost. And then if we have capacities, we can then tackle more complex ones later. And I would think that for EOSC, it would also be good to do it iteratively like that, because otherwise we look at that complexity and say, oh, can't be done. So
I think that's a great point. I think, you know, taking it iteratively, in the same way you would do for openness, you know, start somewhere small, somewhere that you feel confident, and then expand outwards from there. I also think for Ruth and Pauline, your comment, you know, about it being incredibly complicated, I do feel that there is a tendency to panic and feel that no one can understand this. But you know, what Armin is saying is very helpful. You know, try and start a discussion about things that you feel are in your control to start with, and then maybe push out from there. I see Venkat's got a comment in the chat as well. It's a similar problem faced by the long tail of science from a research perspective, that smaller communities might not have the same level of resource, but EOSC is trying to help these by sharing resources across continents. Yes, and that really is a great point, Venkat, you know, that not only start small and expand outwards, but also that EOSC will hopefully provide a resource that people can tap into, so that they don't have to start developing stuff from scratch, and that there are a network of individuals that they can tap into if they need support. Sorry, I saw a hand up, but I'm not sure whose it was.
It's me, Louise Serena. I would just like to add one other element that we tend to forget in many of the projects, especially what we saw already in Horizon 2020. The costs of making data open are eligible costs of projects. And I think this is something that researchers usually just forget or leave aside. So this is something, as we said before, it's something that you think of in your data management plan, possibly when you're already starting planning of the project, and add these additional costs in your project in advance. So it is possible, and something that that could be done and recommended to your researchers.
That's a great point as well. You know, as Irina says, a lot of these are eligible costs in grants. So instead of just assuming that you'd have to ask your institution for help, why not think about looking at how your grant can help? Jorge, I think, had your hand up?
Yeah, just one quick comment, if I may. Yeah, I fully agree about the iterative approach because it has to do with the dimension of each entity, of course, and whether it is private or public. Of course, I fully understand that. But for instance, in the university, at least here in Portugal, as already Irene also said, beyond the eligibility of the costs, also we have mandatory rules for human resources policy, for instance, considering anonymization. I mean, we already have some strategies that are fully imposed by law concerning some, anonymization about the data, including health data of all the staff and working in teachers and researchers operating at University of Coimbra. So eventually, this could be a starting point for those entities that don't have it. And also we have some laws and normatives and regulatory national level concerning GDPR. So actually we have a starting point that is imposed by law. So of course, a lot has to be done. But I think both countries, through the national agencies and the entities, at least the public ones, I mean, the universities, whether they're public or private, whatever, eventually this could be an issue for small entities, I suppose, companies and stuff. But I think we already have enough documentation, also regulatory, so it can be a starting point for those that are not fully comfortable about the anonymization strategies and GDPR implementation or DPO. By the way, we back here, we were imposed the DPO, so we have to create these figures, not something that we cannot just choose not to have. We had to have, so we had to give training to a dedicated person and designate it formally. So yeah, we are fully aligned. I understand the iterative issues and that are required in some cases, but of course, this is all part of the strategy. So that's it.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's very important to really understand your national research ecosystem and what opportunities you have there. Definitely important. I think it's also important to recognize that the ERICs, because they work pan-European, are also doing a lot of good work in this area and developing guidance for their researchers. So it's a great opportunity as well to look into what they're doing. I saw some hands up, but I'm sorry.
That was me.
Yeah.
I wanted to add to this discussion and also to the initial question raised about employing the data protection experts. So there is an issue across the continent that we actually don't really have many legal experts who can provide answers to all the questions. For example, we can train data protection officers about some general issues, some typical issues, but sometimes when it comes to very specific issues, we don't get the answers. And that is one of the reasons why people are discouraged to open their data. I was discussing with some colleagues, there are so many individual issues that an expert in an area can raise that actually are not covered by training for these experts. So I believe that we should think of pooling together some kind of question and answers resources. For example, the University of Gdańsk, as far as I remember, they have this bridge of data where they have some specific issues and legal experts discussing these issues about data management, etc. So I think that we should consider collecting these exotic or rare issues or very specific to some areas and creating a kind of a resource where that people can consult. Also, we are discussing the skills for various kinds of stakeholders and professionals. And I believe that the issue of training legal experts for these topics is not sufficiently stressed, and that we will encounter this problem in future, that actually we will have probably these positions at universities, but it would be quite impossible to find proper experts that could answer the tricky questions.
I think because this training is specifically on EOSC, it's important to recognize that EOSC is not going to solve this problem. As we've seen from the discussion, issues to do with GDPR and control of data are very complicated, and the rollout of GDPR is incredibly diversely managed across institutions and across countries. But hopefully EOSC, by providing a coordinating role, will provide a central point where these discussions can be coalesced and aligned. But it's definitely not something that EOSC can say to solve in the next few months. In the interest of time, let's move on. This is a really rich discussion and I really appreciate it. And please do feel free to keep adding points to the document as you see fit. So the next question is, what if a researcher initially has access via an institution, but then is between, I presume, between contracts or institutions and thus loses access to EOSC temporarily? Venkat, I'm going to defer to your expertise on this one because it's to do with the AAI.
You caught me off guard. I was just typing something else. So how will AAI actually work for access to closed-in?
Actually, no, we're on the question above. So what if a researcher has access to EOSC via the AAI via their institutional sign-in, but then moves institutions and temporarily loses access to EOSC?
Right. Okay. So I don't actually know the answer to that. Yeah, if you, well, typically if you, I mean, it depends on how long the time might be between switching from one job to another, I guess, because typically a person doesn't lose access immediately after they leave a job. So there's that. But yes, I'm not entirely sure. And of course, if you're using something like ORCID as login, which is independent of that, then that should at least still allow you some access.
Yes, that is definitely a good point, to log in using your ORCID, which is your persistent identifier.
I mean, that I always use ORCID instead of OpenAir, put it that way.
Yeah, so Irina says ORCID is probably a better option, but definitely we can double check this and add more to the document afterwards. But I think, you know, encouraging researchers not only to have an ORCID, but to use it to access infrastructure such as EOSC is very useful. And similarly, how will AI work for access to closed environments, since it's possible to log in with social accounts as well? Again, Venkat, do you have any insights on this?
This is something I think I'm going to be learning about more as we develop the sensitive data training as well. But listen, the one thing to remember here, if you're talking about a closed environment, meaning some kind of data safe haven or trusted research environment, TRE, even if you log in with AAI, that doesn't automatically mean that you would gain access to sensitive data. There will be other access control mechanisms in place to actually allow you to be able to see that data. So AAI, yes, that lets you into this EOSC ecosystem, but then there are layers, and so you will still need further authorization, I think, for anything sensitive in nature.
So the AI login is not a carte blanche for you to dig around in everything. There are still, you know, the existing checks and balances for accessing sensitive data or closed environments. Jorge, do you want to put that in the document? If you have another question. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, I was just trying to contribute. I wonder if I was not the one who wrote down the point and the question, but I wonder if underlying the question is the point of open discussion of who owns the data. I suppose eventually who asked this eventually could have this underlying, but of course I can write down.
It's a big question, who owns the data, of course, and I think it is important, you know, to recognize that that is a question that comes up a lot. But I'm hoping that as EOSC upskills repositories to be CTS certified, and these repositories start being aligned into a European-wide network of trusted digital repositories, that we will have less of these questions of researcher versus institution and rather have the questions of researcher and institution relationships with repositories. I keep seeing hands being raised, but then put down. So if you have anything,
because you're just so eloquent in your answers, Louise. No, I did bring up the question of researchers losing context via their institution. It's an interesting thing, because when we talk to researchers about using the EOSC, they are becoming more and more aware, if they're in the early stage of research, that they might not always be at the institution that they're at. And so I definitely think when we instruct researchers on using the EOSC, that using an ORCID or a similar personal-based identifier is really in their best interest for the long term, not only for tracking their data and their output, but also for things like this.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think, unfortunately, we are seeing a massive rise in fixed-term contracts within the research ecosystem. So encouraging researchers at all points to have an ORCID just so they keep track of what they're doing and be assigned appropriate credit for it is important. And it does link into, well, it has a beneficial side effect of being a useful way of accessing EOSC. So the next question is differences between local personal data protection acts. That's a really interesting one, and it's definitely one that a lot of work is being done on at the moment to try and align personal data protection acts. As we've seen in the discussion about GDPR, even when there is a European-wide act on management of data, how it is implemented in situ can vary because individuals foreground or interpret things in different ways. So I think we will always be seeing differences in local data protection acts and local implementations of GDPR. However, as has been mentioned in the discussion about GDPR, I feel that EOSC, by providing a coordinating level and providing a means for international discussion on these issues, will hopefully be able to align and sort out some of these issues in the future. I don't know if any of the other colleagues would like to raise any issues on this. No. Okay.
Not really, but yes, Louise, as you said, I think it's something that that we also as researchers are looking across that. One element that I see being followed is with the really large surveys. So in social science, these are usually European social survey or some else. There are different so basically different recommendations of use. So it's not necessarily consent. It might be something that is a value of a community, because this is something that is more let's say comparable across different local acts. But yeah, it will always depend on a survey, and it is recommendation when you're doing cross-national surveys that you try to put a bit more efforts into reviewing what is needed before you actually do the survey, not just accessing the data, but when you're doing the collection.
Absolutely, it's a great point to raise. Thanks for that. So moving on to the next question, how will PI be managed amongst the positive data? I'm assuming PI would be persistent identifiers, not principal investigators, because we do not know how to manage them.
Personal information.
Oh, personal information. Okay. How will personal information be managed amongst the positive data? In terms of EOSC, exactly the same way it would be managed amongst deposited data into institutional repositories or national repositories or so forth. The expectations for how personal information is managed will not be changing in any way. I don't know if anyone else would like to enrich that answer.
Okay, thank you.
So it's important, as I said before, it's important to recognize that EOSC is a federation of infrastructures rather than an infrastructure itself, or a repository itself or a cloud itself in that way. And because of that, it is relying very heavily on good practice and good management amongst the trusted digital repositories within Europe. So ensuring that the data are managed on a repository level rather than EOSC imposing a top-down management system. So,
okay, yeah, I was just wondering if it will be a specific policy for that. Thank you.
I think there will be better guidance coming out in the future, but it will definitely be, because data are so different and the requirements for managing sensitive data differ so much between disciplines, that EOSC is very much relying on the expertise and the best practices within the disciplinary communities rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all approach to these issues. In terms of a clear infographic to explain AAI for research to understand, definitely something that we have already been talking about in EOSC Future, and hopefully in the coming months we'll be able to recontact you and let you know that we've actually been able to do something about this. In relation to the complicated rules, infographic workflow chart would be great. I'm actually going to be showing you an infographic flowchart for GDPR in the coming section of the presentation. So hopefully that will address at least one set of complicated rules. I think it would be great if we could get more of these. And I think if we, when we go forward and create a community of practice for EOSC trainers, these are things that we can definitely take forward to create for use in our own trainings.
And Pauline has a hand raised. Pauline, go ahead.
Pauline, go for
Sorry,
it.
me again. Just a quick clarification about the EAI. Are we talking about one common authentication system, a federation of one? I'm sometimes a bit confused with we call it DEAI. And does someone have an answer to that?
I'm assuming Irina or Venkat will have an answer for that.
So yes, there is an EOSC AAI federation, and so the AAI isn't, again, I'm not a technical person, and this is my understanding. The AAI isn't actually a technical infrastructure in and of itself. It's actually a registry of logins, basically, from, whatever service provider or ORCID, all these things. And so that registry is what is checked when you do the login. And if you're not on that list, then yeah, you won't be able to
not
log
part
in.
of the club.
So
Okay.
would it be fair to say conceptually it's slightly similar to Eduroam? As in, you would have your own institutional login, but it allows you to log into other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess that is true.
Just
yes.
conceptually, I mean, as a way of helping trainers explain that to researchers, not as in a blueprint. That it's a way of trying to help researchers position it within something that they already understand, that your institutional login will help you log in other places. And similarly, the EOSC AI will allow you to use your institutional login or your ERIC login or so forth to log into EOSC and then access other resources. Or did I just make it more complicated?
I think it's also my understanding to go in this direction.
Yeah. I think it's helpful sometimes when you're talking about these big pictures, instead of delving into technical specifications, to actually just try and link it to something with your training participants that they would understand, and then build from there. Okay, this is great. Thank you so much for this discussion. Let's move on. Yes, let's move on to the next section of the workshop, because we are having such a good discussion that we perhaps are slightly running behind time. So the second issue that I really wanted to talk about was equitable access. So equitable access means the ambition underpinning EOSC that all research products should be equally available to anyone who wants to access them, be they at a research institution or in the general public, or indeed in the future within the EU or further afield. So issues relating to equitable access. EOSC is, of course, driven by open science and the commitment to how research products should be available to anyone without an access restriction. So this understanding of open science breaking down any sort of barrier to research products is really underpinning and at the core of the design and the thinking around EOSC. So thinking about equitable access includes thinking about issues of access for a number of different communities that have previously been quite marginalized from accessing research products. So these are researchers from low-resourced or poorly connected institutes, early career researchers, members of the community, and also users beyond the EU who potentially are not able to access EU research data in its current formats. So EOSC has really taken these issues of equity to heart, and at the core of EOSC is the notion of fair and open by design. So EOSC is obviously driven by a commitment to fair. It's at the core of EOSC design. It drives understanding about aligning data standards and enhancing interoperability. EOSC is currently funding, well, the funding around EOSC is currently funding a number of different projects that are really trying to implement FAIR in design. So one example is FAIR Core for EOSC, which is designing tools to enhance fairness within the EOSC core. The interoperability and interconnection of services within EOSC are premised on FAIR, and a number of working groups within EOSC are extending FAIR data standards not only to, extending FAIR standards not only to data, but also to software and training materials to ensure that everything that is integrated into the EOSC environment is FAIR compliant. And then finally, there is a lot of movement towards integrating trusted digital repositories as safeguards of fair data management. So upskilling TDRs, getting them Quartra Seal certified, and ensuring that fair data is at the core of the way that they manage their data assets. In terms of open, we've already talked about the fact that EOSC embraces the well-used adage of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. EOSC is also relying on funder policies to support open research practices, and in that way kind of snowball open science practices within the EU and how the EU is responding to EOSC. At the moment, there are a number of case studies, as I mentioned, that are demonstrating the utility of open research practices and how these open research practices and the use of EOSC can accelerate research and enhance interdisciplinarity. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about those at the end of the workshop. So EOSC is also addressing equity by putting a lot of effort into capacity building. And one of the key areas, and the area that all of us on this call are working on, is education for different user communities. So at the moment, the EOSC Future project, which is the one hosting this call, is working on developing training for 4 main groups, which are the users, so the researchers, the trainers, which is you, the providers, and the intermediaries. So the providers would be providers of EOSC services, and the intermediaries would be institutions that facilitate interactions with EOSC, such as universities and so forth. The training that's being developed for these groups are also being split into learning pathways for subgroups. So, for example, users can include researchers, research support staff, citizen scientists, and so forth. So the aim is to provide accessibility, to provide support for training, and not only to support. Sorry, I've just got myself confused there. So the aim is to provide training for a number of different user communities, and to ensure that anyone who wants to access EOSC resources has the training to be able to do so in an effective way. And it's also important to recognize that EOSC, like the rest of the EU, prioritizes the inclusion of previously marginalized communities. So providing accessibility support for training to include communities with disabilities is incredibly key. There's also targeted capacity building. So EOSC funding calls targeting different geographical regions and countries to ensure the spread of expertise and knowledge. So many of the EOSC projects will be working with a subsection of EU countries in order to build capacity within these regions. There's also a rollout of training within the EU and a diversification of training languages to improve local capacity. And we've seen the advent of the EOSC champions, which are trying to build momentum and raise awareness within their own national context and their own regional and disciplinary contexts. So really core to providing and ensuring equitable access to EOSC services and products are trained individuals that will help us monitor data management planning and monitor infrastructure development and monitor the interoperability of services, repositories, and other products. And in concurrent to upskilling individuals in these areas, there's also quite a significant investment in data steward training and the professionalization of data management roles. So it is recognized that key to the success, not only of EOSC, but also of research within the EU, is the need for a huge amount of data stewards being integrated into the research landscape. And EOSC, together with the EU, is providing quite a lot of training for data stewardship. And there's quite a lot of discussion about how best to integrate these into research institutions. So now we'll go back to our mentee, or actually we might just go back to the Google document, because I think that worked quite well. To now have, a bit more of a discussion about issues to do with equitable access. So are there any access issues that you're concerned about? Are you concerned about certain research communities that you work with not having access to EOSC? Are you concerned, for instance, that EOSC is more science focused and that the humanities and social sciences are not being addressed in the same way? Please go back to the Google Doc and put in any questions or comments that you might have.
Louise, maybe you want to also mention about the learning paths, about how we're targeting individuals by that as well as the actor groups. We're also thinking about these learning paths, which I know you've done more work on.
I did actually mention it.
Did you? Sorry, I must have missed it. Sorry.
Go back to the slide, no problem at all. If you missed it, maybe some other people missed it too. So as I said, EOSC Future, and particularly Work Package 9, which is the one that we're all representing on this meeting, is developing a lot of training for potential user communities within who will be engaging with EOSC. And then we're identifying 4 main groups, so the users, the trainers, the providers, and the intermediaries. And we're developing a range of modules that can be used to upskill these different communities. This, for instance, is part of the suite of training for train the trainers. What we are doing as well, is collating all these different modules and all these different resources, and then providing learning pathways through the resources that will be hosted on the EOSC Knowledge Hub to enable subgroups of users to find resources that will be particularly useful for them. So, for instance, we will have learning pathways for researchers, for research support staff, for citizen scientists, and so forth. So as the training outputs of EOSC Future mature, and as more of them are loaded onto the Knowledge Hub, you'll see the evolution not only of chunks of training for these 4 main groups, but also targeted pathways that you can use if you're building training for a specific group, such as research support staff, that will guide you through these different, through the huge amount of training available online to identify specific modules and specific resources that will be useful for you. Irina has put the link to the public wiki that mentions the learning pathways that you'll be able to understand a bit more about in the future. So Venkat, did that cover what you were wanting me to say, or is there anything else that you wanted to add about the learning pathways?
That was great. No, sorry, I missed it. I missed you actually saying the word learning path. I don't know why.
You were lulled into a sense of happiness by my slides. No problems at all. Okay, so we're getting some great questions coming up here. And maybe give it another minute for people to finish typing, and then we can maybe go forward and talk about these. Okay, the first question is one that really resonates, I think, with many people, is how to address the feeling of being in a silo, that you're one person at an institution for ethics and legal issues relating to EOSC, and what tools or resources exist. It is definitely the case for many people on the call and for many people that we've been engaging with, that they have the remit within their institution to start getting people talking about EOSC and getting people to think about EOSC. And it can be very intimidating, not only because EOSC is a continually evolving entity, but also EOSC is a very broad entity, and it involves everything from legal and ethical issues to data management to actual technical infrastructures, which can be quite complicated. It's important to recognize that you are definitely not alone, and we're hoping by workshops such as these and the resources that we are developing that we can provide you with a range of tools that you can use to start thinking about how to start these conversations within your own community. I already mentioned the Knowledge Hub and the learning pathways, and hopefully these can be tools that you can take forward as a kind of download and adapt model, so that you don't feel that you have to become an automatic overnight expert on everything, and that you have to create resources from scratch. So that can be very helpful. I'd also like to mention something that I found very useful in the past, is joining communities of practice. So there is a community of practice that's run by OpenAir on training coordinators. It's not specifically relating to EOSC, but there are a lot of trainers within the community of practice who do training on EOSC or will be training on EOSC in the future. And it's a great way to just meet some more people who are also training and also dealing with some of these challenges. And it's a great opportunity to share expertise and share best practices. So I don't know if anyone else on the call wants to mention anything more about the community of practice. Irina's very helpfully put the link into the chat. If anyone would like to join, It meets once a month, and it's a very welcoming and open group.
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And importantly, just as an additional thing to what you're saying, workshops like this, even other workshops, these are opportunities to network as well, and trying to get rid of that feeling of being isolated in a silo. These are real opportunities. Okay, unfortunately, many of these are still virtual events, but you can still do good networking, and that's the opportunity to try and break out of those silos.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I guess one thing that we are restricted with these workshops is obviously GDPR and circulation of attendance lists, but definitely there are ways in which we could think about in future workshops creating something that people could reach out for, maybe individuals within their own national context that they'd like to liaise with in the future. So it's definitely something we'll think about. So moving on, how could EOSC improve access for low-income countries or any countries out of the EU? The open data is clearly accessible, but what about onboarding, etc.? The person who wrote this question is definitely tapping into something that I'm very passionate about, is the inclusion of low-income countries into the open science ecosystem. EOSC at the moment has not done a huge amount of work in thinking about EOSC beyond the EU borders, but it is definitely something that's in the agenda for the future. I know that, for instance, myself being a South African, there has been networking relationship set up between the EU and South Africa to help provide examples of good practice and expertise from EOSC to the currently developing South African Open Science Cloud. And I know that EOSC is similarly in discussion with the African Open Science Cloud about how best practices can be shared and synergies being capitalized on. CODATA, so the Council for Scientific Data run by the International Science Council, they have a project at the moment looking at aligning global open science clouds. And there is a lot of work being done looking at how to align infrastructure development and requirements around these open science clouds. But it's important to recognize that EOSC, like most other regional open science clouds, is currently in development, and it's going to take quite a lot to get it up and running for the EU, let alone up and running for the rest of the world. So this is definitely something that is with it. It is definitely something that is being recognized, but not something that has a huge amount of effort being put into it at the moment. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
I would like just to add that the associated countries which are not in the European Union but are to be accepted ones were included through the NIFOS Europe project, and that they were actually they passed all the procedures the same as other countries and were involved in the onboarding, and their services will be onboarded to the EOSC catalog and marketplace. And also within this project, the regional catalog services has been developed, which actually includes quite a number of services. This was achieved through the European Union funding. So if funding could be provided, it's not impossible to provide support to less developed countries.
And that's a really great point, because EOSC is being iteratively developed through a number of projects. And each of the projects has a different constellation of countries or a different focus. It's developing very good understanding and awareness of how to integrate countries into EOSC and how to build user communities within those countries. So hopefully the experiences of, for example, NIFOS will be very useful going forward in reaching out beyond the EU. And I think that aligns with how do we reach all communities. Of course, there's a lot of work being done in publicizing EOSC. We just saw the EOSC symposium happen in Prague last week. So it's definitely hoped that by increased awareness and capacity building, different communities can be reached. I think there's definitely still a lot of work to be done in educating communities about how to use EOSC and how it can be of benefit to them. However, this is a work in progress, and definitely, hopefully, we'll be seeing the benefits of this work in the coming months and years. And Pauline, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to make a small comment. I mean, we know we are all trying, and it's work in progress. Sadly, I mean, we have been in meetings that were very related to EOSC basically a few months ago, where people raise their hands and ask, what is EOSC? I've never heard of it. And I know it's very difficult, but I think sadly we are still very far from
I think
broadly to reach our community and raise awareness.
There's definitely a lot that needs to be done before we can say that EOSC is reaching its targeted goals of seamlessly integrating government, commercial, citizen scientists and researchers. But definitely there is planning to take this forward. And while it can be frustrating at the moment to recognize that EOSC awareness is not particularly well integrated into communities, it's important to recognize that there is work being done on a very steady basis to try and raise awareness in these areas.
No. I mean, originally it was not what I raised my hand. It was to clarify the next point, which I wrote extremely unclear. It's just about, you said about raising capacity and training. Just from experience, we have organized open calls in EOSC Life, which is one of the EOSC cluster projects, for user projects. And what we've tried to do was to offer support from other experts that had more skills in the fair world and that could be considered as fair experts. what we clearly could see is that fair experts are not a thing. Like a fair expert cannot help a scientist in all field of science. And there are some communities where we are lacking the fair expert that can, I'm not saying that they cannot provide support, but definitely not all scientists can support other scientists if they are using very different type of data or very different type of resources and softwares. So I agree on principle that training the community and having training events is important, but this is on a day-to-day basis, it's quite complicated, and very often the support to be useful for new community building has to be a one-to-one support. We have managed to help like new communities building, but really on a one-to-one support with fair experts, and it takes much longer. But any big events on, training about fair has, I think, no real impact on the new community building. People know that they have to go fair, but if they don't have the tools and the support to go that way, they will go nowhere.
Absolutely. But it's important to recognize that there are different levels of training. There's training for capacity building and awareness raising, and there's training for community, and then there's targeted training for skills development. I think what you're mentioning, though, is not necessarily just a lack of targeted training, but also the recognized critical lack of data stewards within research environments. That there was a recent figure that the EU research ecosystem is lacking at least 500,000 data stewards that need to be trained by, I think it was 2025 or something like that. And I mentioned in previous slides that there is a lot of work going on to try and train up data stewards, but we're not going to see a huge change in one-to-one support for verification of data or embedding fair practices into individual research plans unless we have the expertise on the ground to be able to help these researchers, particularly to develop a cohort of data stewards who are disciplines experts, as well as data stewards. That's definitely what you're mentioning here. And this is not necessarily just a problem of EOSC, it's a problem of the EU research ecosystem more broadly. But definitely there is a huge need for more data stewards. Does anyone else want to add to Pauline's comment? Nope. Oh. Everyone's on that level. Just to go back to the data stewards, I mean, there are definitely data steward trainings that can be done. I know that CoData RDA schools for data science also run data steward training, and the University of Vienna has just started their first certificate course on data stewardship. And there are other opportunities such as Essentials for Data Support, which is run by my organization, DUNCE, and a collaboration with some other Dutch institutions. So there are trainings out there, and I think that for researcher communities to recognize that it's not just about attending one workshop. There's no magic one to make people experts in these areas, and there needs to be support for data stewards to take these trainings and to have the opportunity to use their expertise within their research context. Jorge says a cohort for data steward career. There we go. There's, yes, EOSC Life Biodata course. Yeah, so there's definitely trainings out there, and those are the type of trainings that need to be supported within these within institutions and within research groups in order to build this level of data stewardship expertise, rather than sending people to more broad trainings that are more designed for capacity building.
Yeah, I just had these two researchers concluding this course. It's quite interesting and quite relevant. And of course, it will operate somehow as training the trainers also on this specific branch of life science, of course. Yeah, the next question I just put shared here because I integrated the final panels of On Merit project, and it has to do with equity and not sharing the same starting point of all entities and countries. So somehow it's related with the low-income countries, not exactly because we are talking here. My question is about the inner circle of the EU, but even though we stated, and proved that, of course, the obvious that the countries, different nations along the EU does not have the same starting point, considering the resources and the capacity to implement the same open access policies. So I just wonder, since we produced a lot of recommendations, of course, address it to EU and specific DG, but I wonder eventually projects like On Merit and others eventually could contribute to as a starting point, considering the different starting points of each country and of each entity's different ecosystems as a starting point for reaching the equity.
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning it. It's a great project, and I see that someone has put the recommendations into the document.
Irina, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so definitely it's something to think about, and definitely as we start having these kind of international discussions around these issues, we can hopefully start snowballing and building up awareness of these recommendations going forward. So in the interest of time, I think maybe the last question I will just hand over to Kim, because this is her area of expertise, and then I will just quickly flip through the last few slides that I have. So Kim, do you want to say something about accessibility?
Sure. Just briefly, because I saw that someone mentioned that they also have given training on accessibility before, and that is a very broad term that can cover a lovely amount of things. But I did want to mention that through the EOSC Knowledge Hub, we are working on elements related to make sure that the training we offer is web accessible, as well as the documents are accessible to all trainers and users who want to access that material. And then going forward, and I think this is an important thing to state as well, like accessibility can never be done perfectly, but doing something is better than doing nothing. And I would love to make that approach really clear when we're talking about ethics and legal issues as well, is that within the EU, we are guided by regulations related to making content accessible. And it's an often lesser discussed issue of legal because it's still being implemented at national and international levels. So if you're interested in more in what that can mean for the research that you're delivering, I'll say that tomorrow's workshop is on providing training materials, and the training that will be available online further in the year, as well as what has been offered from EOSC Synergy, does discuss about making training materials accessible. So if you're unfamiliar with that frontier and you want to know more, you can also access the EOSC Synergy training materials in the handbook.
Absolutely, thanks for mentioning that. And I'm sure Pascal will put the link for Synergy in the chat. So we are doing really well with regards to time, and I would like to spend the last few minutes just talking about some interactive tools to start ethical and legal discussions. So I hope that the last two sections where we built up a list of questions and answers has really helped give you some understanding of how to answer some of the concerns that you might have relating to EOSC. But it can sometimes be very intimidating starting a training on ethical and legal issues, because if you're not a trained ethicist or a trained lawyer, you feel you don't have enough expertise. But also people do come out with these quite challenging questions, and sometimes you don't have the answers to them. But the key to starting any trainings on ethical and legal issues is to start a discussion. So it's important to recognize a number of things. If you understand the structure of EOSC, you can usually help guide discussions about ethical and legal issues. It's important to recognize that most research infrastructures have existing training and existing guidance on data management, and that much of the EOSC ethical and legal training can be folded into this existing training. So it's not like you're starting from scratch. However, new training can be made more interactive by using interactive tools, and discussion is really key to ethical and legal training to identify concerns and problems. It's one thing for any trainer to get up and tell people about the ethical and legal issues. It's another thing altogether to really drill down into what's bothering people and try and find a way to target what's bothering them and to offer solutions in the future going forward. So using tools I've always found very useful because of a number of different reasons. The first is if students are coming to these discussions for the first time, particularly thinking about disciplines such as engineering and the natural sciences, there's not as much of a familiarity with ethical issues as there is with the health sciences, for instance. So if students are unfamiliar with these issues, they may not know what to ask, or they might find very uncomfortable raising issues in front of their peers and feeling that they're the only one who doesn't get it. It also can be that by just asking if anyone has questions and then moving on if no one raises their hand, you block out having space for concerns, questions, and opinions. And understanding and addressing these concerns, questions, and opinions is really key for defining use and compliance uptake. So if students walk away and go, well, that was really interesting, but I don't think they answered my questions, or it doesn't really apply to my research, your training will have very little impact because they won't go forward and engage with the practices that you suggest, or indeed engage with EOSC. Using tools and having a kind of discursive approach to training can also be a really useful way of systematically going through a topic to ensure that all students are aware of all steps. And the tools can provide additional support and structure for educators who are new to teaching these topics. So the tools that I'm talking about are many different things. They can be discussion prompts, they can be interactive group work assignments, they can be self-assessments, they can be checklists, they can be case studies, and they can actually be games that you can play with your tools. And what we're very pleased to be able to present is that we've done a bit of a whip round to see what we could find in the ecosystem. And we found many tools that can be created, that have been created for FAIR, for open science, for RDM, and for GDPR, that can be used to also initiate discussions around EOSC. So I'm just going to use the next few minutes to actually talk you through some of these. So in terms of open and responsible research, the Foster Project a few years ago created open science cafes, which are a set of decks, a set of cards with statements and questions relating to open science and projects that are working on open science. They're not necessarily statements of like absolute statements, but rather starter questions that can and prompts that can use you to help you to start the discussion. So these are examples of some of the statements on the cards that can be used by the instructor to initiate a discussion. So you could use the open science cafes in practice and add a few discussion points around EOSC, such as how a federated research infrastructure can support open and responsible research. Similarly, the Wellcome Trust also created a set of cards called Cafe Culture that allows individuals to start discussions on the challenges faced in research culture, reflecting on what better research culture would look like, and to propose solutions. These are also downloadable cards that you can access. And then these cards could be quite helpful by adding some discussion points about EOSC, such as how the culture in your institution can be changed to support EOSC use. Haplo has an ethics monitor. This is a commercial tool, but it focuses on streamlined ethics applications and is often used by universities who aim to practice good ethical governance. And it can be possible to use this tool to examine how ethics approval needs to be adapted to include the use of EOSC tools and data sharing. So looking at what the ethics applications in your institution looks like and what you need to alert your ethics review committees to if you are going to be using EOSC tools and services. NIFAS created a self-attestment tool called ROLEC that looks at the implementation and adoption of EOSC. So it can be a really useful tool to use for group activity to assess EOSC readiness and areas to work on. So it provides a series of questions, and this can be used as a starting point for discussions about how to implement EOSC services and practices into your research environment. In terms of data management and FAIR data, there are a number of different tools. So FAIR Aware was a tool created during the FAIR's FAIR project, which is now hosted by my organization, DUNCE. And it's a tool, it's a checklist tool that assists students in thinking through how they will make their data fair. Usefully, it also has an option for educators to collate the results and use it as a start for group activities. So you can collate all the results and say, hey, I see that everyone is struggling with the interoperability and FAIR. Let's have a discussion on that. It can be a really useful way to start discussions about how FAIR is at the core of EOSC design and how users need to be aware of FAIR requirements in order to effectively use and participate in EOSC. Similarly, Fuji is another tool created by FAIR's Fair. It's hosted by Pangea at the moment. And it's a web service that allows people to assess the fairness of research data objects at the dataset level based on the FAIR's Fair data object assessments metrics. So you can input a data set and run it through Fuji, and it will give you a scoring based on how fair the data set are. So this can be a useful tool to look at data that's already held in your institution and to start a conversation about further verifying collections, start a conversation about perhaps moving towards becoming an EOS service provider in the future. What Data to Keep is hosted by the DCC, the Digital Curation Center, and it's a systematic checklist developed to guide researchers in making decisions about what data to keep during and after a research project. It can be a useful tool because, of course, EOSC supports sharing of data, but does not support data dumping. So this can be used as the start of a discussion on what to keep and why, and to roll that discussion into what to make fair. DMP Online, also hosted by the DCC, is an online service that helps you create, review, and share data management plans that meet institutional and funder requirements. It's a really great discussion tool, but can also be used to understand how EOSC fits into data management and how this is integrated into the design of your DMPs. It can be used as the start of a discussion of how this would occur in practice, and also how your metadata would need to look like in order to be fair and EOSC compliant. The League of Data Games is a game that was created by Shock and Sesta. It's a fun interactive data game that allows players to play a kind of innovative version of a data management challenge. It's really fun. It can get students excited about data management. It's slightly more engaging than just walking them through a DMP, but it's also a great way to start a conversation about what they learned playing the game and what they would need to take forward, not only in their own data management, but also preparing to engage with EOSC. In terms of GDPR and sensitive data, I'm a very big fan of the data protection decision tree that was developed by the European Commission. And this is an interactive decision tree that allows students to map out questions that they need to answer in relation to the sensitivity of their data. So it schematically walks people through the decisions that they need to make to identify what level of openness and closeness is appropriate to their data. So it's a really useful way, particularly also if you're not a GDPR legal expert yourself, of starting a conversation about GDPR. It's a really useful tool for getting students to identify areas that they're not sure how to answer and starting discussion about these different areas and what needs to be done. It's also a really useful way if all your students are getting stuck in a certain space to be able to identify and reach out to individuals within your institution or within your research environment that will be able to provide more targeted training on these different areas. The ADRC, so the Australian Research Data Consortium, I think, Commons, sorry, also has a really great flow diagram on sensitive data, and that is a helpful discussion tool. Also similarly walks you through what you need to be asking yourself and what your specific responses should be. Think, Check, Submit is a tool that helps researchers identify trusted journals and publishers for their research with a collection of different checklists. It's particularly a useful tool to draw attention to predatory publishers as a growing discussion on ethics in research, but also as a growing discussion on trusted endpoints for research outputs. So it's a useful tool for starting discussions on responsible dissemination on research outputs. And then, of course, this is just a snapshot of some of the tools that are available, but there are lots of other tools that you can use for getting interactive sessions going. There are tools that you can use for discussing credit, authorship, and getting scooped. There are tools for open publishing, open science readiness. The Foster Open Science Handbook, Chapter 1.6, has great examples and practical guidance on starting open science training. And then my organization, DUNCE, has collated an open document on some other tools that we like and that we think are useful. So there are lots of resources available to make teaching more fun and interactive, but also a lot of resources that will take the burden off researchers feeling that they have to provide all the content themselves and provide all the discussion points themselves. But of course, there are also tools upcoming within EOSC, particularly from EOSC Future. We've already mentioned the training resources that are going to be available on the Knowledge Hub, and the Knowledge Hub is also going to be linking to training resource catalogs of other ERICs and other infrastructures. But we are ourselves in EOSC Future also going to be making our own versions of EOSC discussion cards, and the science projects that are currently underway that are showcasing interdisciplinary research using the EOSC environment are going to be written up into case studies that can be used for teaching in the future. So there's lots of stuff that's coming up in EOSC, not only from EOSC Future, but also the other EOSC projects that are currently underway or starting in the future. So please do sign up, follow the projects on Twitter, sign up to the updates from EOSC, and keep engaging, because these will be systematically rolled out over the coming weeks and months. So that is all that I wanted to talk about at the moment. Thank you so much for listening. We've got 4 minutes left, so are there any other questions that you'd like to raise at this point?
Additional tools.
Oh yes, please do add the additional tools to actually, if we can add them to the Google Doc, and then I will put them into the presentation so that they're all there at the moment. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope that it has not only given you an oversight into how to start discussions on ethical and legal issues, but also some answers to some of the questions that you've had, and also some useful tools that you can use to start planning ethical and legal training within your own institution. I do hope that we'll see at least some of you at the community of practice, because it would be great to keep in contact with everyone and to keep the conversations going about how best to start approaching training in EOSC. What I would also recommend to everyone who's got time is to join the session tomorrow, which is specifically looking at pedagogy and EOSC. So our colleague Helen Clare is going to be leading the session on how to design training curricula, how to be integrating innovative and interactive teaching into your training. And then I think there's going to be some more discussion on integrating accessibility tools into your training. So the materials in the video will be shared in the wiki later in the week, and the video will also be shared on YouTube. We will be updating the Google Doc that we've been working on today to add some additional resources. So everyone's got the link of it. Please do keep having a look at it, because hopefully it will be a dynamic resource that we can use going forward in the future. Jorge, I suppose we'll get the session video an opportunity to sign up for EOSC cards and other updates. Yes, as Kim mentioned, the video will be available and the materials will be available in the wiki afterwards. We will be publicizing any new training materials that are coming up. So do please follow the EOSC Future Twitter account so that we can keep you up to date. Otherwise, you can join the newsletters and the other updates.
And I think Irene Kuchma mentioned if you want to sign up for the EOSC cards, you should just, you can send her a message or send Louise a message. Am I right in that? I think I saw that earlier in the chat.
Yeah, but I think it would be a good collective activity exercise if you're interested.
Irina, are you offering your email to be the receiver of people interested?
So just for clarification, this is if you'd like to be involved in developing the cards, or if you'd like to be involved in receiving the cards.
Developing the cards.
Yeah, so if anyone would like to participate with the working group that is developing the discussion cards on EOSC, please do send Irina an email, or training@EOSC Future an email, and we will get you linked in. If you would just like to receive a copy of the cards when they're ready, don't sign up. We will be releasing information about that once they're ready, but they are definitely not ready yet. So we are not going to be sending you anything like that at the future. But anyway, we are on the hour. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope to see many of you tomorrow or in the future. But if you don't have time, have a lovely day going forward and a lovely weekend when you get to it.